Hey guys, if I look exhausted, it's because I am exhausted. Early morning here in Victoria Harbor, on my way to the gym to do my 200 push-ups. Just a couple people out here in the early morning jogging and such. Anyway, I'm making this video partly because actually I forgot to bring my books with me to the gym, and I got to the gym and they weren't open yet. All right, so they're opening a little bit later today so they can do yoga classes before they open up the floor for the rest of us to lift weights. It's another story. So come down and see the seagulls. Maybe we'll see some seals. Maybe we'll see some river otters too here on the coast before I go and lift weights. Look, guys, inequality always has this kind of aura of injustice about it, and I think as children we appreciate, or we're taught to appreciate, fables, stories in which the poor become rich, the rich become poor. The ugly duckling grows up to be a swan. The ugly girl grows up to be a beautiful princess. Even that poor people marry rich people, which is statistically very unlikely in our society and historically in European society. We respond positively to stories that don't represent the familiar tragedy of the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, of people's disadvantages just getting worse and worse as life goes on. And of course, I think we all rankle against this also within the system of formal education, credentials, and in terms of informal education, being an autodidact, educating yourself, just learning without the strictures of a university around you, without a teacher, without an assigned textbook, without a test or an exam, simply the inequalities in human intelligence. Those can be quite scary and quite frustrating to that natural sense of human justice. I don't know, just the yearning for people to have an even playing field, for the game to be fair rather than rigged. There was a comment on my most recent video that got a lot of thumbs up, and I don't think people were giving it a thumbs up because they felt this guy was disagreeing with me or that he was refuting something on my video. I think people gave the thumbs up because they sympathized with his story. A guy wrote in and said that he was 31 years old, and he had wasted 10 years of his life, but that he was going back to university now, that he was pursuing his dreams, and that he really didn't like the fact that I stated bluntly in my video that I felt the person I was criticizing, Amy K, a particular person, that she had wasted years and years of her life, and now in her 30s was not going to be able to accomplish much of anything. She wasn't going to be able to make the transition to being a parent. She wasn't going to make the transition to having a particular career or what have you. So various people responded to that. And as I say, I think people were giving the thumbs up, not so much because he was contradicting me, but because they liked the uplifting story of him saying that even though he had wasted 10 years of his life and put a footnote on that, we don't know what that means. When someone tells you they didn't go to school and they didn't have a career, they didn't do anything meaningful because they wasted 10 years of life, does that mean cocaine? Does that mean methamphetamines? Does that mean video games? Does that just mean, I don't know, lassitude, just lack of ambition, not doing anything? Well, you don't know when someone tells you they've got a gap of 10 years of their life. And there were also people responding to this about whether or not my meaning was strictly biological, like that this there were two sides to the biological view of it. Some people believe, and I think this is quite false, that like the human brain is only capable of learning new things when you're young, or that the human body is only capable of having and raising children when you're young. Well, no, this isn't about capability. This is about ability. This is about acumen. This is about self-discipline. Okay. So Amy K, this is really for me a digression. This isn't the main point of the video. Why would she make a bad mother? So the woman specifically featured in that video. It's not just that she's old. She's old, and she's still childish. This is about the development of the mind. That's what I'm talking about here. Why is it that she is incapable of going back to university and starting a new career, learning some new field? It's not that she's old. It's that she's old and she's still childish. She's still immature. And those issues of developing acumen, they don't rely on formal education. They don't rely on credentials. They don't rely on having a teacher and an assigned textbook and an exam. It certainly is possible to work as the checkout guy at a grocery store, to stand behind the counter and be a cashier in a grocery store, and to be going home every night and reading Aristotle and passionately studying ancient Greek, and to be incredibly well prepared when you decide in your 30s to go back to university. But that's not what we're talking about here. I mean, those people, real autodidacts, are extraordinary. And the other tragedy here, I mean, education takes unequal people and makes them only more unequal. If you had the self-discipline to be an autodidact for 10 years or being a cashier, to work really hard at any one thing, whether it was ancient Greek or modern Korean or Japanese or almost any serious intellectual pursuit, you would develop the acumen, you would develop the self-discipline to then apply your mind to a new and different field, which is something I've demonstrated in my own life again and again, for better and for worse. Now, I could here digress. There are limits to that. To what extent can I apply the mental self-discipline I gained in learning Laotian and Pali and studying Cree and working on Chinese and studying history and politics? To what extent could I apply that to mathematics? Could I go back to university and really try to do math seriously? Could I go back to university and try to do chemistry seriously? To some extent. I mean, to some extent, I'm prepared just with my level of alacrity, acumen, self-discipline, my understanding of the academic process, like just how to study for an exam in any topic, how to be organized, even how to ask for help, how to recognize when you're working alone with a chemistry textbook. Wait, I understand this part, but I'm not following what's here. And whether I go to Google for help or go to the tutor for help, go to the university for help, and being positively encouraged and focused on filling in the gaps in your own understanding. There are some skills that I can take from the study of Chinese language, history, and politics and apply to chemistry or math. But for sure, there are limits. And some things are much more directly applicable. It would have been very easy for me to apply my background in philosophy, from philosophy in one language to philosophy in another, from ancient India to ancient Greece, or from modern Europe to modern China, Japan, and so on. Some of these transitions are easier than others. And for sure, I mean, anyway, enough about me. This guy left a comment saying, in this positive and uplifting way, that even though he wasted 10 years of his life, he's now going to throw himself into university, and he doesn't feel that he's lost his opportunities in life. He doesn't feel that he's, by wasting 10 years, whatever the waste really means, he doesn't feel that this is something he can't redeem or can't compensate for. Really? So your claim is that because at age 31, you think you can still do what a 19-year-old can do when they just finished high school. You think you can compete with the 19-year-olds. So you think you're cool. So you think there's nothing for you to regret. You don't think there's a problem that you lost those 10 years of your life. You're dead wrong. You're dead wrong. So you think when you finish this program in your 40s, you think you're going to be at the level of what? A 25-year-old or something? It's tragic. We don't want to accept it. We want to imagine that, okay, just about the time we're getting mature enough to accept that, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, we want to have a kind of meritocracy of the mind. We want to imagine that, at least in terms of our intellectual accomplishments, we have some kind of democracy. We have some kind of even playing field. And we don't. We have a slanted playing field. And the inequality over time only gets more and more extreme. There was a young woman who I flirted with and joked with in one of my university programs. Saying young woman, but like this guy, she was into her 30s. And one day, I asked her kind of what happened to a gap of about 10 years in her life. Because we talked a couple times before. We got along. We had some kind of mutual attraction, which was why we talked to each other as much as we did. And all she could say to me was, during those years, during some number of years after she'd finished high school, she said all she did was party. And you don't know what the word party means. You don't know if it means cocaine or methamphetamines or champagne or just video games. Just sitting on the couch playing, Nintendo or whatever the video game system was at the time. You really don't know what it means. But, whether you're looking at Amy Kay, or this guy writing into me about his dream to go back to college, if you weren't developing your own mental acumen, your own mental ability, your own depth of knowledge and experience in some really meaningful way, you've got a deficit there that you're not going to be able to make up, that you're not going to be able to compensate for. And, the depth and significance of that tragedy, it's very hard for people to accept. It's very hard for people to deal with. That same young woman who lost 10 years partying, she did get a master's degree. She finished her master's degree. And I knew the whole context she was in at that university. But, frankly, a lot of the time professors with an older student like that, they just kind of wave them through. They don't really hold them to the same standards as other people. She finished her master's degree, but what was she a master of? She was a master of nothing. And was she at the level of knowledge, ability, capacity of a 25-year-old or 22-year-old? Not really. Not really. She was a dried up has-been who, happened to have this credential and had nowhere near the level of knowledge that someone should have at her age in her field. She wasn't a master of her field. She wasn't a master of anything. And if you have become a master of one thing, of something, you can, as I was saying before, transfer that from one field to another. You can take the level of self-discipline, focus, clarity, and acumen that you've developed studying one thing and apply it to another. The reason why Amy Kay could not now make the transition, even to starting and raising a family, is not, in my opinion, biological. It's mental. It's intellectual. The problem is not that she's 31 years old or whatever she is. The problem is that she's still incredibly childish. If any man, any sane, intelligent man is looking at her as a possible mother, he'd be looking at someone who still needs many, many years from the present to prepare mentally, intellectually, probably even economically, to make the transition from her current totally self-indulgent, totally childish lifestyle to being a mature, responsible, self-disciplined parent who can take on responsibility not just for feeding and clothing a child, but for educating that child, instead of being preoccupied with educating herself or being preoccupied with just being a brat herself. It's appealing, the myth that you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It's appealing, the myth that you can just bounce back. But the vast majority of people, simply put, bounce. I challenged Maud Vegan about this when we had our long debate. I think it's a 3-hour debate about drug policy, about drugs, hard drugs like cocaine and heroin being legal or illegal. And it's really reassuring for people to tell themselves, oh, this person was an addict, like a drug addict for 10 years. But it's okay, now they're back in university. They'll bounce back. No, they won't. The way you would develop your mind if you spent those 10 years just worrying, just being clean and sober, but worrying. Not necessarily hitting the books, not necessarily learning in some other more positive sense, but being clean and sober and worrying, knowing that you were going to go back to university one day. You would develop your mind in a whole different way from someone who's living without any worries, because they're high on painkillers, because they're addled and distracted and deeply involved in their own life of self-indulgence, self-distraction. There's a guy here on YouTube called BioS3 Training, and he had the honesty to say when he got clean, he was a drug addict for about 10 years. And he said, I'm sorry, I forget the exact years involved, but he said something like he finally quit all drugs when he was 27. But he said emotionally, he was still at the level of a 17-year-old, or even worse, that he was this really, really immature 17-year-old. He didn't know how to regulate his own emotions. He didn't know how to discipline his mind. He'd had girlfriends. He'd had long-term relationships, but all those girlfriends had been high on drugs, and he'd been high on drugs. So he didn't really know how to talk through problems, like even just on that personal face-to-face basis. He didn't have skills in terms of management, again, even in a sense, management of himself, management of his own time, management of his own feelings. self-expression and so on. And, he was left in this situation of being, much older than his own level of mental development. Guys, it's much, much easier to bounce back economically. It's much, much easier for someone who was a cocaine addict to turn around and earn a decent living than it is for them to turn around and become a decent parent, or for them to turn around and become an intellectual capable of really accomplishing something with their minds.